Hi, I'm Abigail Metcalf, and I'm going to be talking about Henry VIII and how his quest for a legitimate male heir led to a string of marriages, a separation of England from the Roman Catholic Church, and a reputation for being a cold and unyielding leader. Most people have heard of Henry VIII simply because he's one of England's most memorable monarchs. He reigned during the 16th century, and he went down in history as a man who would stop at seemingly nothing to secure his lineage. I've been fascinated with Henry VIII and his 6 wives since I was young, so I hope you enjoy learning about this topic. Henry's first wife was actually his older brother Arthur's widow. Her name was Catherine of Aragon, and she was the daughter of Spanish rulers Ferdinand and Isabella. She was married to Arthur when she was about 16. Unfortunately, Arthur died about 6 months into the marriage, and for political convenience, she was engaged to Henry, who would become next in line for the throne. They were married, and at the beginning of the marriage, Catherine suffered miscarriages, stillbirths, and she gave birth to a son who only lived for about 2 months. She eventually gave birth to a healthy girl who was Princess Mary, but Henry slowly realized that Catherine wasn't going to give him the son that he wanted, so he turned to the Pope, who was the final say in all religious matters in England, including divorce, which is what Henry wanted. Unfortunately, the Pope denied his request, so Henry turned to the Bible, quoting Leviticus 20:21. If a man marries his brother's wife, it is an act of impurity. He has dishonored his brother, they will be childless. Obviously, Catherine and Henry weren't childless, but in Henry's eyes, Mary simply wasn't a viable option for heir. He wanted a second choice. Around this time, Catherine started to fight back. According to Judith John, author of A Dark History, The Tudors, in order to defend her title as queen and Mary's title as princess, Catherine argued that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, meaning that she was technically never his wife. However, this just fell on deaf ears. Around the same time, Henry took on a mistress whose name was Anne Boleyn, and Anne became pregnant. In order to ensure that that child was legitimate in case it were a son, Henry decided to take matters into his own hands, and he separated England from the Roman Catholic Church, and he established a Church of England. C.N. Truman, in his article The Reformation, says that when Henry left the Roman Catholic Church, established the Church of England, and named himself as supreme head, he was saying that the Pope no longer had power in England or over its subjects. Henry was free to do whatever he wanted. And his first order of business was to divorce Catherine and marry Anne. Anne gave birth to a healthy girl, Princess Elizabeth, and then Anne suffered 2 stillbirths, which were both sons. And this didn't sit well with Henry. It was basically the beginning of the end for Anne, and Henry slowly grew tired of her and wanted to get rid of her. In order to do so, he had her arrested under the charges of incest, adultery, and witchcraft. And because no one argues with the king, Anne was found guilty and beheaded. The beheading of Anne Boleyn really left a mark on Henry. Even though he maintained that Anne bewitched him, most people assume that he simply grew tired of waiting for a son, as most historians say that there is little, if no, evidence behind Anne's charges. Whatever the reasons were, Henry quickly married again to a woman named Jane Seymour. They were married only 10 days after Anne was beheaded, and Jane eventually gave birth to a son, Prince Edward. Unfortunately, Jane never recovered from the birth, and she died about 2 weeks later. And it's important to note that she is the only one of Henry's wives who was afforded the funeral that a queen normally gets. And when Henry died years later, he was buried with her according to his will. Even though there's evidence to support that Henry really loved Jane, her death made him fearful that their infant son would die as well, and so Henry quickly wanted to marry again, and he decided that his next marriage should double as a political alliance. And he found that alliance in the German territory of Cleves, which, like England, had left the Roman Catholic Church. There was a powerful duke in Cleves who had a sister named Anne, who was eventually engaged to Henry. When Anne moved to England, Henry realized that he was very upset about her looks. He did not find her attractive, and after they were married, he realized that her personality was just as ill-suited for him. And that marriage was eventually annulled. Because Anne made it easy and didn't fight Henry, he rewarded her with property and houses and a yearly income of £3,000. So she was taken care of for the rest of her life. His next wife was Catherine Howard, and at this time, Henry was 49 years old, and he was considered an old man for his time. Catherine was only 19, and she apparently had a very flirtatious personality, which, according to Johnson Lewis, author of Catherine Howard, is what drew Henry to Catherine. But that was ultimately her downfall as well, because about a year into the marriage, she was found guilty of adultery, and she, like Anne Boleyn, was beheaded. Henry's final wife was Catherine Parr, who Henry was in his 50s at this time. He was an old man. He was obese and had a lot of health issues. They never conceived a child together. However, Catherine did help rebuild the relationship between Henry and his two daughters, which had become strained over the years. Henry eventually died. Catherine outlived him, and Henry's son Edward took over the throne. Henry is remembered for his long string of wives. Even though most people incorrectly assume that he beheaded more than 2 of them, that just adds to his infamous reign. What Henry perceived as his wife's inability to give him male heir was the downfall of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. The son that he so desperately wanted ended up killing his 3rd wife, and his 4th wife was actually pretty lucky because her annulment agreement allowed her to live an independent life. Catherine Howard's flirtatious personality was her ultimate undoing, and Henry's last wife outlived him. A popular mnemonic you can use to remember the fate of Henry's wives is divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived.